That's great, Tina. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. This is obviously our first HR webinar for 2022, and we're delighted this morning to bring you, I suppose, a clear focus on the pending Gender Pay Gap Information Act 2021. It was signed into law, I think it was July last year. Mary will correct me if I'm wrong. And I suppose what we want to do this morning is in particular look at what we need to know as employers about the legislation, how to implement it. And obviously we're still waiting on the regulations to be published by the government. But I suppose we're nearly clear enough that it's going to be somewhat based on the UK model. And I suppose to look at reporting and overall how we meet our obligations as an employer. The last webinar that we did was back in October 2021, and we looked at that one about the return to the workplace and dealing with all those complex post-COVID issues. And I'm sure we're all very grateful on this call that the lifting of restrictions and the return to some normality is obviously very welcomed by us all. I'm also really hopeful that this is our last virtual webinar, and it would be great to actually meet some of you face to face. And for me, and maybe for some of you, that would be the first time meeting each other. I think the last 2 years have been so challenging from a HR professionals. In particular, I just also want to thank the HR Working Group Steering Committee. We continue to collaborate and obviously work well together. And we've got 4 events that are planned for 2022, and I can talk to you about those in a little bit more detail at the end of this webinar. I think I would have said this at the last webinar that I suppose we can all recognise as HR leaders that, we really have become champions of change. And both C-suite and employees alike have really realised, I think, throughout the pandemic, the greater role that HR has taken on during that period of time. And I think it's really tested our skills significantly. And as HR leaders now, we need to ensure that we capitalise on that and continue to maintain that influence across our business. And obviously in building, the resilient workforces that we already have and facing the challenges ahead. Obviously, it does bring a lot of additional challenges to us, and in particular around the whole area of employment law, compliance and governance. And I think, on the backdrop of the global pandemic, along with the great resignation and obviously inflated salary costs, there's a lot that's been chucked at us as HR professionals at the moment. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome and introduce Mary Cullen to you. Mary is Managing Director of InsightsHR, which is a unique HR consultancy company, and they were established back in 2000. And Mary and her team, they possess a diverse skill set not often found in internal HR departments. They have a blend of academia and far-reaching experience, means that are not afraid to confront HR issues that maybe other firms shy away from. They offer customized solutions so that clients always receive the full benefit of their expertise. And over the years, they've built up a strong client base which spans many different industries and sectors. And they've partnered with clients that has given them invaluable opportunities for the development and strengthening of their core offerings. They specialise in employment law compliance. They're experts in workplace conflict management, and they give their clients full confidence, which enable them to reach appropriate resolution smoothly and efficiently. So we're really delighted to welcome Mary here today to talk to us about the gender pay gap legislation, and also to have a much broader discussion around gender balance and the impact that the legislation will have on organisations. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Mary, and she has a fantastic presentation which will take us through all of the concepts. And as Cliona said at the beginning, please post your questions. Mary might even be so good to ask us a few questions as she goes through it to try and get the dialogue going among us. I always believe from a HR perspective that it's great to learn from each other and to hear what other organisations are doing. So we love to hear from people today on the call in terms of what they're doing within their organisations. So Mary, I'll hand over to you.
Hey, thank you very much, Sharon and Cliona and Leah, for welcoming me here today. And as Sharon says, I love to have an interactive discussion with HR people about what they are or aren't doing around this whole area. It's very new, and we don't have the regulations in place just yet. In some ways, I'm not sure that it's even going to be a requirement for us in 2022, although the Act is there, the regulations aren't published, and there's no guidance yet around what it's going to look like for us. But we can, I guess, look at what they're doing in the UK, and we can start to make preparations now for what will be coming down the line. And I'm going to share the presentation now at this stage, but I would love if you have questions that you ask as we go. I'd love to hear what other people are doing if you've already started this process. If you haven't, don't worry, that's you and the rest of the country. There's only about 2 or 3 major employers who are doing significant work here at this point in time. But I think we'll see over the next year more and more people starting to work around this area. So I'm going to share the presentation now. Okay, can everybody see that? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, perfect. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. So again, just to make it move. Okay, so it's important that we start with what the legislation and the regulations are likely to be. So the Gender Pay Gap Information Act 2021 was implemented, as Sharon said, in July. So you were correct, Sharon, last year. But the Act has yet to take effect. And that's probably not all that unusual in Irish employment legislation. They tend to leak what something is going to look like, solicit feedback from employer groups and trade unions, etc. And eventually we will be presented with what we must do to comply with the law in the form of regulations and in the form of guidance. So the details of the reporting regime is yet to be outlined in regulations, which will be published by the Minister for Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. But there, you know, I had a look before coming on today to see, look, is there any noise? Is there any movement out there around when this is actually going to happen? And I've seen from some of the, you know, organizations similar to ourselves who talk about this kind of thing, saying that, you know, they're going to do events and information sessions around June, giving the indication that we might see something between now and June as to what those regulations are going to be. But I also noted that an awful lot of those providers said that they might cancel at the last minute if the regulations aren't actually in effect. So there's no clarity around that piece. From your perspective and the kind of things that are important for you to think about, Ireland's gender pay gap currently stands at 11.3%, according to the research published by the European Commission, and that's just below the European average. So from our perspective, what does that actually mean in terms of the position of women versus men and their pay in Irish organisations? It indicates that men are paid more than women when averaged out across organisations. And that doesn't mean that discrimination as such is necessarily going on within our organisations. It may mean that women, even from an educational point of view, are channeled towards different industries at an early stage in life. And I'll talk a little bit more about why those things might happen. But from the legislation and the regulations perspective, we do know that there's new reporting requirements for employers, and what they're meant to be, whether it will happen or not. And Sharon, we had a brief discussion before we came on here, and Sharon said she'd heard somewhere or read somewhere that it might actually be as far back as 2024 before the regulations are in place. COVID has certainly slowed down a lot of things, and that's true also in the UK, where they've had gender pay gap reporting for a couple of years now. So what we might expect if the regulations are published this year, that in 2022, employers with 250 employees will be required to report on the difference in the pay, the average pay and the median pay between men and women at all levels within their organizations. In 2023, that if it goes ahead this year, so bear in mind this isn't factual yet, but in 2023, that will be extended out to those employing 150 employees, and 2024 for employers with more than 50 employees. So as you can see, it's going to touch most organizations, or most, from an SME up to larger employers. And the reporting is going to focus in on the differences in pay, bonuses and benefits in kind, broken down by gender, put simply between men and women within organizations. And so it's going to be, I guess, quite onerous. Will it fall on HR to do those calculations? No, I think that will very much rest with payroll, and it would very much, I guess, in the first instance, be something that is largely handled by payroll. Now, often, and the reality is, some HR people and HR departments are responsible for for payroll as well, but it is a set of calculations that will need to be undertaken by the organization. And really what HR do is interpret it and help develop the action plans to combat any differences, gaps between the pay of men and women, if that makes sense. And it's, I suppose, quite an interesting area generally. Some people, I think, have a view, and I've seen this right throughout society, is this a feminist issue as such? And it's interesting to hear the various views that employees and employers alike hold around this whole area. I don't see it as a feminist issue. I see it as an equality issue. And from an organizational perspective, while there may be a requirement to report on the differences in pay between male and females, there may also be a requirement to look at the differences from an organizational perspective in the pay between different ethnic groups as well, and how all of those are treated. So it can very much be part of your diversity and inclusion strategy. So when it looks at, what is that actual pay gap? It means the difference between the average gross hourly earnings of men and women in an organization. And so again, I emphasize the point that it doesn't necessarily indicate discrimination, bias, or an absence of equal pay for equal value work. That's actually illegal, and our Equality Acts deal with those particular issues. It really, so paying a woman less than a man who is doing the same job or work of an equal value, that is prohibited by law. And although that might happen in organizations, that's not what this particular piece of legislation is about. And generally what it points towards are that men and women may not be equally represented throughout an organization when it comes to pay. I hope this is making sense. And Sharon, if you have any questions at any point, feel free to jump in at any stage and ask me. So, you know, what's actually responsible for causing a pay gap? Because I think an awful lot of the discussion centers on the calculations. You know, how are the calculations going to be done? Who's going to do the calculations? What are we actually meant to be looking at? But I think it's probably a far wider and systemic issue, a societal issue, not just a workplace issue. So when we look at, you know, what might cause that gender pay gap, you know, one simple thing in terms of the education system, there is evidence to suggest that in girls' schools, for example, that subject choices such as mechanical drawing or woodwork or metalwork aren't offered, or if they are offered, they might be offered at times that are clashing with other subjects like home economics or French or something like that. In terms of the education system, it's clear that there's no difference between men and women when it comes to their ability around maths. And yet we see far less women in engineering, and I'm making generalizations without it being, you know, targeted at anyone in particular, but, you know, there's less women who move towards science and mathematical jobs and engineering and technology jobs. So it's not a difference in terms of ability or capability or competence. Our education system in itself may not be geared towards women entering these fields. And in the areas of work, when it comes to a gender segregated labour market, what I mean is that the areas where women might dominate, like nursing, health, for instance, nursing, teaching, and areas dominated by women, there's a tendency in research shows that those professions are paid less than those that are dominated by men. Again, the why, you know, there is a fact, women do step out of the workplace at times for family purposes, for care purposes, for domestic responsibilities. We all know that happens. There's a physical reality for a woman who's having a baby. She, you know, will be leaving work for a period of time. And what happens when she comes back? It's at that point that you start to see the disparity between pay between men and women. Because on entry, so if you look at, you know, a graduate intake in an accountancy firm, for instance, they're all coming in at the same level, men and women, having gone through education, having gone through training. And it's at the point of having the first baby, the second baby, the third baby, that the earnings may start to drop for women as they dip out of work to take care of family, or their domestic responsibilities, or their care responsibilities when it comes to elderly people in the community. Again, affordable childcare is key here, because, you know, missing, you know, as the number of children you have increase. I know my daughter has just had 2 children. I'm a grandmother of 2, and, you know, she has the equivalent of a mortgage to pay for those 2 girls so that she can go to work and continue in her career. And it's at that point there is evidence to show that men's earnings, once they have children, start to increase and women's earnings start to decrease. And it's quite interesting. And again, I don't see this as a feminist issue. I see this as just a reality of the way in which our our society and our workplaces are structured. You obviously can have the discrimination, the assumptions, the biases. You know, a woman might be missing from a meeting and the assumption is it's due to family care responsibilities, where that assumption might never be made about why a man is missing from a meeting. You know, and these are just an example of conscious and unconscious bias that we might all hold. And then there is an overrepresentation of women in part-time roles.
Can I ask a question, Mary? Do you mind?
Sharon. Yeah.
Just going back on that slide, I suppose just in relation to the family and the care and the domestic responsibilities, obviously the government have brought in additional leave, you know, targeting men so that men take a more proactive role in the home. Do you see what the government have done? Is that going to make such an impact? You know, I know in my organisation, you know, that there has been an uptake, particularly around the parents' leave, around the new parents' leave and that, which is great to see. But like I don't think it's enough. And then you see the likes of Vodafone. Vodafone have brought in 4 months leave, you know, for dads to take. Because they're predominantly, I know they're predominantly, you know, they're a heavily male-dominated sector, and then they allow people to come back, you know, on a 4-day week over a 6-month period. Like, that is so progressive. But for small organisations, I probably asked about 4 questions in that. But I think I suppose what I'm trying to get to is, like, is it enough? Like, do we need to be doing more? Does our government need to be doing more? In terms of that whole support network around that family care piece?
I think so. You know, when it comes to parental leave, and you see a very low uptake when it comes to something like parental leave, and that's right across Irish, UK society, you know, that it's not the same. Women are more inclined to take it than men are. And so to, I suppose, like Vodafone, foster a culture that allows both parents to take time and to support both parents to do it. But it's very much about messaging, isn't it? It's very much about what an organisation says it's going to do and what it actually encourages employees to do. So for anyone to leave their career for a period of time, whether that's a career break or a sabbatical or, you know, having a child or your parenting responsibilities, elderly care responsibilities, there is a concern about, well, how will that impact your progression within an organization? What we don't want to do is we don't want to blame people for, you know, leaving work for some of those reasons, for their care responsibilities, whether they're male or female. And we want to encourage both. From a HR perspective, we want to encourage both to avail of those kind of offerings. But time and time again, I see that the uptake from men is quite low. Why? Because in reality, the C-suite, the senior team, the boards, they don't support it. They don't support men taking leave in the same way. And you know, that in itself is a challenge, and it comes back to, from a HR point of view, what can we do? You know, if our education system, our society, our organization structures are set in a certain way, what can we do as individuals? Because you often, when it comes to gender related issues, someone who's raising them is brandished, you know, a feminist, and a negative connotation associated with it. And we have to move away from that kind of thinking, so that we're actually bringing about real and genuine change in our organizations that makes sense to the bottom line. Because remember, you know, what are we there to do in HR? We're there to support the organization achieving its organizational strategy. How might you know, supporting women, reducing that pay gap, bringing about a more equal organization do that? That's in our retention, our attraction, our support of people in their careers, our influencing our C-suite, our leadership team, convincing them that this makes sense. And we have to do it from a gender pay gap reporting perspective. And there is evidence in the UK that has reduced the pay gap. We've a long way to go. And I've heard some talk about it maybe taking 60 years in the UK to actually reduce it. You know, and that's quite a staggering idea, that it will take 60 years for men and women to have equal pay, for all of these reasons that I'm talking about here today.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah. But that's got nothing to do with your reporting obligations.
No.
It's just the why. And I think we do need to understand why does this matter? Why are we being asked to do it? And what's the bigger picture from an organizational perspective? So, you know, what does it mean for you, for your own particular organization? What we measure and assess, you know, tends to drive change. We're not measuring it, and we all know that from, say, a performance management perspective, or from, you know, an organization that has KPIs or operates through objectives, or, you know, that if we're not measuring it, then nothing changes. And so the whole purpose of the legislation is about measuring, reporting, and driving change. But let's be honest, there is a name and shame element here, because if we follow the UK model, you are going to report your data and place it in a central repository. So for any of you who might be interested in how that looks in the UK, you can go to that central repository and look at the pay gaps per organization. We are going to have the same thing. So imagine a new entrant or somebody that you're trying to attract in your organization. Not only are they going to look at your website, research your organization, look at the roles and opportunities, but now they're able also to go to a central repository and see what the pay gap is there, and whether or not, you know, they're going to be able to achieve seniority within a particular role, or whether or not the equality is taken seriously by that particular organization. And remember, the first report may not be positive for your organization, because when you look at the mean and the median differences between the pay of men and women, you might be surprised by what you find. It does support that constructive debate and action. So once you get those figures, once some system spews out all of those calculations for you, and once you sit down as the management team to look at, well, what can we do? In the UK, there's a narrative that goes with your report, and many organizations also publish, as part of that narrative, an action plan as to what they're actually going to do to change, to reduce that pay gap. And it'll give the organization an opportunity to review what's working for the organization, where the obstacles or challenges exist for the organizations, and what actions are needed for change. And that obligatory reporting propels the EDI to the top of the agenda again. But we've all seen over the last couple of years, you know, these days it's surprising to find any organization that's not talking about diversity and inclusion as part of their strategy. And I'd be really interested to hear if anyone wants to share, are any of the strategies that they have looking at that male-female divide, or is it looking at a whole range of other things? I don't know if anyone is brave enough to share.
It'd be great to hear from some people around the table here on the approaches that they've taken, if anyone would like to share with us. Anybody?
There's no pressure either, because you know, it's, I don't see it as discriminatory as such. I see it as you know, maybe a large portion of employees in organizations might be taking up part-time roles. Who are they? Are they men? You know, when it comes to looking at, you know, what's happening in an organization, it mightn't even be immediately obvious to you. You may not realize that actually it's predominantly female rather than male when it comes to part-time and temporary roles. So feel free to jump in at any stage, anyone who has a question. So when it comes to, you know, the things that you are going to actually have to look at when it comes to the calculations, you've got the difference, and this again is not fact. We're waiting for the regulations, so just bear that in mind. If it looks radically different when it comes out this year, next year, or in 2024, just be aware that these are the things that you probably need to start looking at and planning for now. It may be different in terms of the Irish regulations versus UK regulations, but we're likely to be looking at the difference in the mean hourly pay of men and women, the difference in the median hourly pay, the difference in the mean bonus pay, median bonus pay, the mean pay of part-time employees, of temporary employees, the proportion of male and females who are paid bonus pay, the proportion of male and female employees who receive benefits in kind, and the proportion of male and female employees in the lower middle, upper middle, and upper quartile of the pay bands. And so that is likely to be the information that you have to gather from your payroll, and the information that you're going to have to report on and place in that central repository where other people can see, along with your narrative or your published action plan. And there may be a requirement to post this on your own website as well. So it'll be very interesting to see as the data starts to come out about Irish organisations, because, you know, and for an awful lot of organisations, we don't have that pay transparency, you know, and Sharon, I'm sure, certainly as somebody who's involved in recruitment, in terms of your perspective, the idea of pay bands and knowing what a job is worth before you actually apply for it. So many jobs are dependent on experience, and so there is that level of secrecy, isn't there?
Yeah, there
around
is. Yeah.
Organizational pay, particularly as we get towards the more senior levels.
Yeah.
And at the more senior levels, you've got more men than women.
Yeah. And even like I know in some organizations, employers would have written into a contract that you can't discuss your pay with any other employees. You know, so what is that going to look like? You know, when reporting does come into place. And I suppose for people within organizations, if they were to see a gap, and as you said on one of the slides, you know, it may not be a positive message. So there's the whole impact of that as well from an employee perspective. And it's all well and good we talk about managing our messaging externally, but the internal piece is so important. And I know from you know, reading some articles and that on it, you know, a lot of advisors around this area are saying, you know, you really need to engage with your employees as well and share it with them so that they understand. And I think looking at the root causes as to why, you know, the gaps exist within the organization. And I know, like within CPL, you know, we've got very clear programs around promotion. You know, we have promotion panels. They're made up of male and female senior people when we're moderating people coming through. You know, and we try to, well, not that we try, it is as equitable as we possibly can have it across, you know, our workforce. But all of those things do impact, you know, that they do have an impact on that gap and closing that gap. And I know you're going to talk more about that, you know, in a couple of slides, Mary, in terms of how you try and bridge that gap. But there is a lot for employers to take on. And even when you look at all of those different components of the calculations. Like, it's like, oh my God, you know, there's an awful lot that employers need to consider and get through. And then the analysing of that information is so critical as well, and how that's represented. But there's a big difference between the internal and the external piece. The external piece is about managing your reputation and your brand and what potential talent may see. But the internal piece is, you know, if you're a female sitting there and you see that there's a 17% pay gap, well, what does that mean? Am I working for free part of the time? So it's all about that. You can get. I think as HR leaders, we shouldn't underestimate the emotions that it may bring out as well. And I think our C-suite and our leaders will be looking at us to really support the business in, you know, figuring out that messaging. And you probably need to get ahead of it as opposed to waiting for the regulations to come out. And I say that for our own organisation because, like, we've done a little bit of crunching of the numbers and we just sort of, we don't need to worry about that at the minute. We'll park it there. But, you know, we really do. So.
Yeah, and I mean, let's not underestimate the kind of cost associated with reporting, never mind the cost associated with change. Because, you know, if you're an employer who publishes every year that you have an unchanging pay gap, then you will be, you know, sending out certain messages about your organization. So in terms of closing that gap, what might you need to do, and what kind of investments might you need to make? What kind of changes might you need to do? You know, very interestingly, I'm doing a culture audit at the moment with clients, and, you know, I'm interviewing lots and lots of the employees in a representative sample of the organization. And it's just staggering to talk to some of the female employees who, one of the questions I asked, you know, do you have an ambition to be part of the executive or C-suite? And some do. Can you get there if you want to? No. Why? Because, you know, they're all white and middle-aged men. And that being so common in organizations, not just in Ireland. Let's be frank, this is a global issue, not just an Irish issue. And so, you know, if that's how women feel in the workplace, they can never attain something, not because of their skill, their ability, their qualifications, their education, but because they simply can't get there by virtue of their gender. And that's something that, from a HR leader perspective, we don't want that in our organizations. And I think, you know, the generational differences now, you know, we've all seen people, you know, vote with their feet. Sharon, I'm sure you can attest to that. There's a massive movement of people where people are saying, you know, I want something different for myself. And I think when we get to the point of reporting on these differences between men and women in their earnings, we'll see more of that. And organizations who are ahead of the policy, who are, you know, publishing their data early, who are doing these exercises before they're required to, have a better chance of looking good when, you know, when that central repository is there. So when we look at Britain, and what Britain is doing, you know, since 2017, employers with 250 or more employees are required to publish their overall mean and median pay gaps. And there is evidence that that's reducing and closing that gap. And that's expressed as a percentage, as well as their mean and median gender bonus gaps. Now, this is the most interesting area in that there still tends to be, even though the gross pay gap is reducing in the UK, the the gender bonus gaps continue to be significant. And so if as an organization you're going to be smart, and level the playing field from a salary perspective, but benefits in kind or shareholding, shares, or all of those additional things, if men are getting more of them than women, you may still have that significant gap. And there is some evidence of some of that happening in the UK. So again, when you're looking at equitable practices within your organization, make sure you're looking broadly, know what you have, know what's there. What you report on, what you're required to report on is one thing, and how far you spread it out and really look at it is another. But again, you would need organizational support to do that. So last year, COVID in the UK did interfere with the gender pay gap data, and it was suspended last year due to the challenges presented by the pandemic. So they've missed a year of data. It'll be interesting to see next year how that looks. So what we have learned from the UK is that many employers do test runs before publishing. They calculated their figures prior to the requirements and engaged with their workforce on the topic. Some didn't, and the requirements were confusing and unclear at the outset. So there's a bit of, I guess, if you decide to carry out a payroll audit before the regulations come into effect, you may set your own criteria around that, but I would be recommending you kind of do it based on that list that I provided earlier, because I think that will give you largely what we're expecting to come in. And there was some significant embarrassment for the BBC when a particularly prominent editor, international editor, went public on the fact that she was paid less than her male counterparts. And the BBC since then has had their gender pay gap drop from 9.3% in 2017 to 6.2% in 2020, which is the last report there. But you can see that as an organization, the potential for somebody to come out and say something is unfair. Now that's an equal pay claim, and someone can litigate against the organization based on it. When it comes to gender pay gap reporting, an employee can't take a claim against the organization, but it can go to the WRC. The WRC can enforce. So it is a law. You will be required to do it. And if you don't do it, an employee can raise an issue, or the unions can raise an issue and bring it to the WRC or apply to the Circuit Court. And it can be enforced. And I guess when it comes to gender pay gap reporting, right now it's optional. There's no regulations. That may not become mandatory until 2024. However, it's important that you're doing that test run, you're figuring it out, and you're not waiting until you're publicly embarrassed. So in terms of Ireland and what Ireland have done and where we're at, An Post is the first major organisation who have launched their first gender pay gap report in 2019, when their gender pay gap was 3.71 compared to 13.9% nationally. And they produced a company-wide action plan with guiding principles of equity, fairness, and transparency. And they have become the first major Irish company to report a zero gender pay gap, with the organisation managing to eliminate the difference between male and female average hourly rates of pay in 2 years. Now, An Post have been exceptional in terms of their approach, but have we heard of them? I certainly have heard of them well before the Act was you know, came into law, because it's all over the internet. It's all over their website. They are using it as a way to present their organization in a positive light, showing how progressive they are, showing that they have taken action before anybody else. And they have been, I suppose, able to leverage that in the media, all over RTE, the Irish Times, every major publication. Every major place, even Forsa, are out there saying that we supported An Post and we have jointly worked together to bring about that 0% gender pay gap. So they identified it, they closed it. They have more work to do on bonuses. And again, the bonus area seems to be the place where you might see that difference exist. But what An Post have said about the bonuses is that they recognized the frontline postal delivery service for their outstanding efforts during COVID-19 and paid them bonuses. And their mail service is predominantly mail, and they are looking at launching a campaign. I'm not sure if they have done yet, I haven't seen it, if they have launched a campaign to increase the number of female recruits into the postal service. So how many of us think, I mean, I have a postman. I have always had a postman. It was only when I stopped to think about it that what will we have now? A post person, someone who's involved in the delivery of mail. And, you know, why is that male dominated? What's the logic? Why is it always that men have been recruited into the postal service? And so if you can see that, you know, nurses are predominantly female, teachers are predominantly female, HR people are predominantly female. You know, and I wonder, I'm not sure, Sharon, you might be able to answer that, but, you know, from a management position perspective, are HR people paid the same as other managers in other organizations? I don't know. I don't know the answers to that in comparison.
Yeah, I know from well, I can only talk about CPL, and I would say that yes, they are comparable, and along with bonuses. But in other organizations, I don't know. That, you know, I'm sure there could be a bit of analysis done on that. But it's interesting, like just on the An Post thing, like they have transformed their organization. And if anybody here around the table hasn't had an opportunity to look at their gender pay gap reporting, it's very well done. You know, and I'm all for not about reinventing the wheel, and I'll be taking some good takeaways from what they've done for our organisation. You know, I'll openly say that. And I don't know if anybody else has had a look at the UK website. If you just Google gender pay gap reporting in the UK, you know, you can go and look at any organisation. And I've done a little bit of research and looking at comparable organisations for CPL in the UK. Because I know with our business, you know, we have a challenge with our contingent workforce because we don't set the pay rates for that. It's our clients that do that. So there's those challenges as well. But it is very interesting what An Post have done. And Cliona, I see your hand has been up for the last probably 5 minutes. So if you want to step in.
No, I just wanted, because I mean, obviously it's very, very interesting, and Mary, there's so much information there. It's just great to know a little bit more. Now, I'm not a HR expert myself, and we've a tiny organization, so it's quite a different thing. But I was interested, you've related to the UK. I wondered, is this kind of reporting in other European countries, is it necessary? Like, for example, I don't know the answer, maybe you don't, but I was wondering, has France any lead on this? I
haven't, you know, I haven't looked at France, Cliona, but Iceland is
Yeah.
a very interesting country to look at, in that they claim that they have eliminated the pay gap altogether, and that they have a truly egalitarian society where men and women are paid equally for equal work. But the difference in Iceland is that they get certification for proof that they're paying people equally. So they crunch the numbers. I'm not sure what the specific calculations are, but it is far wider than that which will be required here or in the UK. But they have achieved through what they call accountability, employer accountability. So once you track what's happening, once you measure it, once you are required to prove that there isn't that gap, they have managed to eliminate it. And so they will be the country that stands out as absolutely having eliminated it. Globally, you know, if you look at the Western world, you know, they're all over the world, there is a pay gap. In the US, in Europe, there is a significant pay gap between men and women all over the world. And in some places, you know, where education makes a difference, you will see women you know, increase in their salary. But where it really becomes prevalent is at the uppermost layers of organizations where women are not represented, and the highest paid people tend to be men. And so, you know, it's interesting when you look around the world that, you know, I'm not sure about France, and it would be maybe some of the people here today might have a better view on that than I do.
I don't know if anybody wants to comment.
Yeah, I just Googled it there, and you know, the good old Google. So, and it is mandatory in France. So that's I mean, whether that's, I don't know if anyone around the table has been involved in it in their organizations. It'd be great to hear whether it's a yes or a no.
I can say a word on that, maybe Augustin speaking from Servier. So yes, it's mandatory for a few years now, and it's an index, in fact. So there is specific topic, a bit as you shared earlier in terms of gap, and you have some kind of final note on 100. So you can compare a company between them on the index. I would say that's the reporting side of things. Within the company, there is a movement for sure, as I would say in any countries, but there is still a structural gap between men and women in France, and with a strong culture which will take time to change. And as you said earlier, I think it's the same situation here as well, with repartition of role in the family, the fact that women are taking care about the kids, about the household, and all this type of situations that we know that will take time to change. As well, I think, and you were asking the question before regarding the maternity leave, for example, I would say that until there will be a mandatory paternity leave, which is the exact equivalent of the maternity leave and the pregnancy period for men, I would say that the equity between women and men won't be there, because myself, I would see this really as a major impact on the career of a woman within a company. And until there will be some company leading the way and probably pushing for that. But until there is a clear legislation on that will apply to any company, whatever the size, whatever the situation, I would say the gap will be still there. So we'll manage with evolution, we'll manage with the payroll, but I would say that there is structural, social structure in our society that has to change if we want to have a clear impact on that topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. That was very interesting to hear. And, you know, I think when it comes to what HR can actually do, you know, whether or not your function is involved in calculating the numbers or not, certainly there will be something to do with the data in terms of what programs you put in place. When it comes to Post, you know, some of the things that they did that helped them eliminate that pay gap was, you know, they created gender balanced shortlists for senior management roles and then supported women when they were in those roles. Traditionally, women don't brag as much as men, and you know, they factored that into the recruitment and selection processes, you know, by changing the way in which questions are asked. You can in some ways eliminate some of that bias that might be there in the first place. They created a network for women across the organization. They developed talent programs, now not exclusively for women, but talent programs that women could access. And if you think about some of the barriers that might prevent women from participating in programs, they may be around the time that programs are running. So, you know, additional extra education outside of the workplace, for instance, when that might conflict with care responsibilities. You know, so they were quite thoughtful about a lot of the things that they were doing when it came to their talent programs and their leadership programs and encouraging women's participation in them. And they have full commitment from the CEO and from the management board for the ongoing work that they're doing in promoting fairness and equality. And they've had huge, huge positive feedback on that. So when it comes to you looking at your own organization, these are some of the challenges that we have. You know, are you aware of the gender pay gap in your organization as it stands? Is this something that people are doing? Is it something you're preparing yourself for? I would say get ahead of the posse, start looking at this, start asking questions within the organization. Something simple that you can do is look upwards. You know, how many women are in senior positions in the organization, and do you have enough of them in those senior positions? And what barriers might be in the way if they aren't represented at the senior levels? Is there a gender imbalance in the promotions in the organization? Look at the rate at which men and women leave the organization and think about the causes of that. So, you know, probably one thing in HR that we do see a lot of is that, you know, people don't come back after maternity leave. They take their protected leave, they maybe take whatever leave they're due and resign just before they're due to come back into the workplace. You know, looking at that kind of data is powerful because you can think about, well, what might be happening, and then you can engage with your workforce around those kind of things. Are you supporting part-time employees to progress? Because part-time employees are predominantly female. And so what opportunities are there for those individuals to progress in the organization? Just because you're part-time, does that mean you cannot hold a senior management position? And if we think about that, how many senior managers do we know that are part-time? Do we know any? I have a great dream of being part-time someday. It hasn't happened yet, but do we know anyone who's in a part-time position? Any male or female?
I would have been in a part-time position in CPL up until 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So, and I was very fortunate, and I say fortunate because when you're at that senior level, particularly in an organisation like ours and our size, but I made it work. I mean, I had to put a lot of different support mechanisms in place, but I worked 3 days a week as HR director of the group.
Yeah.
So I had a very supportive CEO to do that at the time. So
yeah,
it's
unusual, Sharon.
It is very, yeah.
Anyone else in our audience who knows of any senior exec, any C-suite executive who's part-time?
Clearly not, and I was joking with Suzanne, who is on the call as well. I was asking if you by part-time you were meaning not working during the weekend and working only during the week. Working 5 days a week or not working 7 days a week.
Yeah, I know, and that's very true for HR roles, isn't it? That our days are long and our weekends aren't often preserved. But you know, from if you look at the generational differences in terms of what younger people expect, you know, younger people, male and female, are looking for more balance. There is that move towards that 4-day week, but I'm not seeing it represented in the senior levels of organizations. I am still seeing those senior levels as predominantly male, and that there continues to exist barriers for women to reach those levels in the organizations. And sometimes, you know, have they self-selected themselves out? Yes. Why is the question. Because it's too hard, or because childcare is unaffordable, or because the organization won't support people. You know, I've often heard managers talking about someone, you know, downing tools at 5:30 and out the door, like a greyhound. I've heard people, a greyhound out the traps. I've heard that expression so many times in my career. The reality is someone has a child to pick up at a creche that's closing, and a family to care for. And so if we're not thoughtful about those kind of things, then we can find ourselves in quite an imbalanced organization. And, you know, organizations like An Post are looking to increase representation at the senior levels of the organization, not just at the postal service level as well. That they recognize that diversity actually is good for the organization and creates not just that diversity, but also the inclusion piece of it, which is so important. And then, you know, does your organization specifically support and encourage women at work? You know, why don't we have enough women in engineering, science roles, maths roles? You know, if you're an organization that works in those sectors, what can you do? Like the An Post, they're looking at their postal service and saying, yes, we have traditionally always had post men, but now we're going to look for post women as well, or a post person. And we're going to do that through our advertisement campaigns, our interviews, our interview questions, and our support of female applicants for these particular jobs. So I'm just checking, are we okay for time, Sharon?
Yeah, we're okay, Cliona. I think, yeah, probably maybe another 5 minutes. I think we're nearly there. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So why complete the gender pay gap now? you want to ensure that by the time you actually have to report on it in a mandatory fashion, that the data is available. And you don't want to run into all the kind of technical and areas and difficulties that you might have by leaving it until the year you're due to report it. So I would say, look at it now, make a plan for how you're actually going to go about this. You need to assess the internal capability to complete that reporting. Do you have the team? Do you have the resources? Do you need to hire in people to do this? And address, where you can, some of the issues before the regulations are enacted and your findings are subject to that public scrutiny. You would also avoid the reputational damage if there's a significant gap, because you will already know about it and have started to address it. And you have the opportunity, just like ESB or the central bank or you know, organizations like Compost, to brag about it in the marketplace and enhance your brand. And it would help you attract and retain the best talent. So that's it. That's me. If anyone has any other questions.
Mary, that was excellent. And I know as a HR professional, I haven't read the legislation, but I've read lots about it. And I think you've put I suppose, a great perspective on it. And I'm sure everyone here today will agree with me on that. I'd love to know if there's anybody around the table who has started looking at their reporting. Even a show of hands if anybody has done it. We're a very quiet group today. Anybody at all?
I may have terrified you.
I think so.
I know that we haven't, so I would love to hear what people are starting to do. I would like to know that, do we have any indication on when we can have confirmation of when we will need to do it?
Not yet.
In terms of preparation.
Because, you know, I mean, they're silent, and I don't believe that it will be in 2022, even though they've said that. I don't believe it will be in 2022. I think it's more likely that if the regulations are produced, it will be with a view to report next year. You know, in the UK, they refer to it as a snapshot. So we take a snapshot, so the period of time. In the UK, the reporting requirements are in March and April. And so I feel, because we passed that period, that it's unlikely that, you know, it'll be September or October, November. I just don't see them putting it into the final quarter of the year from a reporting perspective. I could be absolutely wrong, but I think unless we hear something in the next few weeks, it's really unlikely to be for this year. And I don't think they're going to be able to produce regulations this month and expect you to have reported on them next month. Organizations won't have time. So I really believe that if the regulations are published this year, it'll be with the view that the first reporting deadline will be March or April next year. That's just based on what I see in the UK, because how are organizations going to mobilize in the absence of guidance? So I think half of Ireland, no, probably 90% of Ireland have done nothing. So don't be afraid. You know, it's really about looking at, start the discussion. Start the discussion at the senior level. This is coming. We need to start thinking about this. Do we have the capability? You know, if we had to report on this year, would we be able to do so? And I think that's a significant question, because, you know, you will probably need to hire additional resources to actually do this. If your payroll teams or your salary teams or your HR person is doing a dual role or whatever, you know, you may well need to look at additional resourcing to actually complete this.
And I think also, I know from, you know, the research that I've done across the UK, you know, some companies have reported exceptionally well, like Compost have here, but like you'll be able to look at comparable organisations across the UK, and I'm sure France, because you know, in the UK they have a portal where you can go in, you put the company name in, and it comes up with their reporting, so you can download it and have a look at it. And you know, I know, Mary, you made a really good point. You know, it does push equality, diversity, and inclusion, you know, at the top of the agenda around this. And I know from a CPR perspective that when we do come to reporting publicly, that, you know, this will be very much around our brand in EDI and all of the things that we do to promote gender balance across our organisation. And I think, I suppose, and my takeaway from listening to you, Mary, is that that's really where you've got to hone in on this. You know, yes, okay, it'll look at the data and what, you know, what that gap is, but what are all of the components around that in terms of what you're doing or what you're planning on doing for the future. And I think that's really important, because it is about protecting your brand, because you still want to attract that talent within your organizations. And they're like, you know, there's a war for talent, the Great Resignation, shooting salary costs. We've got all these challenges, you know, that are being presented to us. So I think the whole brand piece is really important about how you do that. And some organizations have done it in a really clever, nice way. You know, that's the only way I can describe it. You know, it's really engaging to read, and you get a real sense of the organization's culture and where they're going, etc. So, so just remember that that would be my advice, is to make sure that you represent it in tandem with everything else about that employee experience within your business.
Yeah.
So, Mary, thank you so much. Fabulous presentation. There's some great comments in the chat there, thanking you. So well done. It was great.
Thank you.
And thank you so much
My
for
pleasure.
your time up. Myself and the Chamber really appreciate it. So I'm sure Cliona agrees, as well as all our members.
Fantastic. We've got a lot of comments there from everybody, really appreciating the presentation. So Mary, we will share it with people, and we'll share a link to the recording so that you can also, within your company, share it with your HR experts. And I would like to thank Sharon for today and for all the work put into this. And in fact, just to let you know, on Monday, in celebration of, well, International Women's Day, as you all know, is next Tuesday, we will have a panel of speakers with Derval MacDonald, who is a well-known journalist here in Ireland, and we'll have two French female representatives and two Irish representatives talking about and including the topic of representation of women on the board. So just you're all very much welcome to that as well. Mary, thank you very much. Lovely to meet you, and we do hope a chance to meet you in person very soon. And Sharon, thank you very much, and we'll be in touch with everybody on the next working group meeting very soon.
That's great, Cliona. Thanks a million.
Great. Thank you.
Lovely to see everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Thank
Bonjour
you.
tout le monde. Merci beaucoup. Have a lovely day. Thank
Au
you.
revoir.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Au revoir.
Bye. Bye. Bye.